Hi, students. I suppose you are good. Easter uh, go away, and we begin a new class. My name is Milko. I am the English teacher in Federico Chueca Center Cultural. Exactly. Well, what is the subject that we must prepare today? Well, at the beginning of our lesson, exactly, we must work about if you know every lesson we begin, for example, to work our English grammar in use, exactly, no? And in the lesson that, for example, part of the class, we see prepositions. Exactly. I suppose there are a lot of mistakes according to using in a sentence, in a paragraph, or in a context. Today, a brief explaining about to use at, in, on as time preposition. Not difficult to identify its position in the sentence. If you use at, normally you use at with time expression. An example that we can locate, for example, if we see I get up every day at 7 o'clock. That is the most using about that. For example, in the situation. Other usual expressions that we use frequently, it's at Easter or, for example, at Christmas. They are very, very usual in every conversation that we can have in the daily life. Well, for example, in this case, for example, for other expression that when we refer, the most important time expression is at, in, and on. When we use in, for example, we use normally, for example, with month. Imagine, for example, that I say, I will study English in London in July. We use perfectly with month and with season. For example, imagine, for example, other sentence that we can use is I would like to visit Ireland in summer. And the other that we can use on normally we use with the days of the week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. For example, I go to gym on Wednesday. A good example. In this case, not difficult to use, for example, about that. But for example, in this case, if you have dates, for example, example that we see clearly the difference. Imagine that you use, for example, this case. Imagine that we say, for example, I start studying English in March. We say in March, but if you have exact dates, then we transform in by on. For example, I start studying English 22 on 22 March. Then is the main difference about this situation. Only, for example, we can make several exercises I can expose totally free to use at, in, or on. For example, every student can write 3 sentences to see clearly the main difference each other about that. A sentence with at, a sentence with in, a sentence with on, clearly to using, for example, in the different sentence. When we finish this part, for example, to explain the different using about the time preposition, we can expose in the class about a subject, about the advantage of disadvantage using English nowadays. For example, it's important to speak English nowadays in every subject from our society. It is clear that without English is very, very complicated moving over world. Imagine, for example, if you, it's only an example, if you travel, imagine, for example, to China. Well, we know that it's very difficult to understand Chinese people in its proper languages, but with English you have more probabilities to move and to understand more things. It's not a good example, visiting China, no? But imagine, for example, Japan, that is a country that with a strong accent, we can say American strong accent, and you can move about that. And for example, what is the problem, for example, a disadvantage of English? That probably in our country, English with the time can get more and more option to catch our languages about. So no, in this case we know many words that they are English and we use frequently in our language. For example, garish, for example, or for example, other word that I have in my mind, coaching, exactly, no? Or for example, other word is moving, curiously, because we have these same words in our language, in Spanish, but that is the problem, that English with the time can dominate the world. With the time, if you see, for example, that you need to learn English in every moment and you can use English everywhere. That is the problem. That then a good question for my students is to ask them at the beginning, for example, for my explaining is what is their opinion about, or give me better an advantage about speaking English for every student, and in another way to ask them a disadvantage of speaking English. For example, no, it's real that with English you can move over world. From, for example, in every Spanish country, probably in the hotel, or for example, somebody know English. What can we do, for example, with other languages? For example, with French, with Spanish, or with German? Well, it's important, but it's for me additional. Imagine, for example, a good student with has a good profile. In this case, well, with additional English, with additional French or German, more option to get a good job. Then is important than only, not only, for example, all reduce speaking English, but it's important nowadays in another languages to have more option that meant a better qualification to get a good job. It's a good work, I suppose, for the students. Only, for example, to analyze the paper about the English language in our society. In this case, we can, for example, to see clearly the difference about that.